Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to review a book entitled Malestrom. And we have with us to give us some insight into the book, Tim Sprankle from Leesburg Grace Brethren Church here in northern Indiana. Tim, welcome.
Hi, Herb. Thanks.
Well, my curiosity is piqued. So tell us about, what would you say the main thesis, the main thrust of this book entitled Malestrom is all about?
This is a book by Carolyn Custis James. She's written a lot of books about spirituality or Christianity and womanhood, and this is a book about Christianity and masculinity. Now, that's what it says in the subtitle, but really it's about Christianity and how we as believers are supposed to pursue our God-given identity, and that's not in masculinity or in femininity. It's about living out the mission of God. And it's a great little book. She says that, as far as a thesis goes, and one of the ways she says that is masculinity is not a birthright. You have to go through rites of passage to achieve that. They're all culturally defined, but the image of God is a birthright, and we're all supposed to pursue that.
How does she develop this thesis? How does this book unfold?
Yeah, I could take you chapter through chapter, and I'll highlight a couple points. Essentially, she sets up a problem. There is a problem in our culture that we're losing our sense of biblical manhood and womanhood as image bearers, and we're pursuing these cultural identifications for it, and it's created a whole big mess. She calls this not the Malestrom, but the Malestorm, and you can see this in the rise of a lot of Christian male movements that are real rah-rah macho, and I'll come back to that later in the interview. But she also talks about one of the things that draws men into movements like ISIS might be something about a lack of identity, and so men pursue really negative versions of a life mission because they don't know what it means to be an image bearer. She talks about young adult males who are prolonging their adolescence and playing video games all day long, and they haven't accepted the role of father and husband as something that's God-given and something to pursue, so they just pursue this malaise form of life. And so those are some of the things she addresses. She also talks about women rising in culture to positions of prominence, so now there are more stay-at-home dads, and this has created a real ripple not only in culture but also in the church. And so she tries to address those things chapter by chapter by taking a look at patriarchy. That's the main thing that she focuses on in each chapter. The old idea of patriarchy, that men rule, and she takes you from the Adam and Eve account in the opening chapter to Abraham and how he overturned patriarchy by leaving his father and his homeland. And then she looks at Judah, who worked through a father wound, which is a common theme in a lot of male books. She took a look at Deborah and Barak in the next chapter and talked about, is the role of leadership given to her simply because no men would step up? And she challenges that notion. She takes you to Ruth and Boaz and talks about this beautiful story. In fact, she's written a whole book on the gospel according to Ruth. And this is one chapter that she summarizes a lot of her work and talks about the role between male and female there and the proper uses of power. And so patriarchy isn't about using your power to maintain your position, but using your power to elevate other people. She eventually gets to the New Testament. She looks at the life of Jesus. She looks at the life of Matthew. One of the things I appreciate most about this book is that she says patriarchy, and the old notion of patriarchy doesn't simply challenge or maybe suppress women. It actually suppresses a lot of men too. It suppresses minorities. And so we need to be careful when we elevate this idea of patriarchy because we're pushing down lots of people. I'd love to read one quote on that topic. I thought it to be really helpful. She says here, although patriarchy tends to favor men and confirm by default privileges and authority over women, it by no means benefits all men. There is only limited space at the top of the human power pyramid. Many men spend their entire lives hopelessly trapped at the bottom, trampled and exploited by other men or by disadvantaging circumstances of birth. Ironically, patriarchy even poses serious hazards to men who seem at first glance to benefit most from this social arrangement. They may live their entire lives ensconced in the status, power, and privilege patriarchy bestows on men, but that may be exactly what leaves them vulnerable to more subtle dangers of the maelstrom. And so she talks about even in our churches, we have certain men who get positions of power because they have an education and they have a job degree, but you don't always see the janitor on the elder board. So she deals with some of those cultural things as she works through biblical stories. The last two, she talks about Joseph, as in Joseph and Mary, and she works through the idea of Paul of Tarsus and some of his understanding of Jesus overturning social status, no longer Jew nor Greek, male or female, slave or master. And she works through that in her final chapter. So each chapter takes a story of the Bible and challenges patriarchy.
What spurred you on to read this book? What was it that caused you to even think about reading it? Because the title isn't very catchy to me, anyway. So what spurred you on?
There are a whole lot of other books about masculinity, but they're written from a male perspective. So I was curious. I wanted to enrich my understanding and read from a female's perspective. I thought she might provide something insightful, and she did. And then the other thing that drew me to this is I know she's a very good writer. So I like her writing style. She has great prose. She's very good at telling stories and weaving personal narrative and cultural observations into the biblical text and the way she works through that. So that also drew me. And I hadn't read anything about gender recently, so I thought I saw it on sale at an ETS conference, and I thought I should pick this up. It's recent, and it's covering a topic I haven't looked at from a different perspective.
In some ways, you've already answered this question, because I think you even said the thing that you thought was most insightful. But would you restate that? What is it that stands out to your mind as far as being extremely insightful as you think through this book?
I really appreciated how it wasn't simply about getting men to be more masculine or getting women to be more feminine or helping people understand their role as male and female, but the overall push here is helping folks understand their identity as image bearers. And I think that levels the playing field without getting into some of these heated theological debates about complementarian or egalitarianism.
Very good. Is there anything you wish she would have covered? As you finished reading the book, was there a sense in which, I really wish she had covered this or covered that? Did you come away feeling that way?
Yeah, there are probably two or three things. I did just say that she didn't really address head-on complementarian versus egalitarianism. I wish she would have taken a little more time to address that theological debate that's going on. And she did bring it up a time or two, but she never took it head on. I don't think that was the purpose of her book, so I see why she didn't do that. She was taking more of a story approach to these stories in Scripture, not a systematic approach. So I appreciate that she did that. But she didn't take on the male movements in Christian churches, which I would have loved to her to address those more thoroughly. But there are a lot of movements about male masculinity now, about getting guys to punch each other and do daring tasks and go on big adventures and camping trips. And that's masculinity in the church because the church is boring to men. And I don't always find that helpful. I think all people need to be pushed to live on mission, but that's a very limited version of masculinity. So because I know there are lots of movements like that right now, I wish she would have addressed that in greater detail. And then the closing chapter, she admittedly says, I got to the end of this, I was hoping to wrap it up with some tidy conclusions, and I can't. I'm more interested in the topic now than I was when I started. I think it's more important now than when I started, but I have nothing real specific to offer as in next steps. I still feel like we need mile markers for people in our church to mark progress in their spiritual lives, regardless of masculinity or femininity. But I was hoping this book might help think through that topic a little bit more, or some practical applications. It's somewhat weak on practical applications.
Okay. How might this book be a help to other pastors? I mean, obviously, it's been a help to you, and this is an issue today.
Yeah.
Egalitarian versus complementarian, and I particularly don't care for either one of those terms. How might this book help us as pastors? What might you say?
Yeah, most pastors, almost every pastor I know is a male, and most of what we read is by males. And we might grab the ear of our wife and listen to her, and we might have some females in our church congregations who allow us their opinion and give us insight in how we do things. But this is a very smart, thoughtful woman who provides a different perspective on male, female, and pursuing our God-given image. It would be foolish for us to not listen to women sometimes as mostly male readers. So I think that in and of itself asks you to read this. And some of her other books too. She has a book called Half the Church that's talking about how half the church or more is comprised of women. We should pay attention to that. The Gospel According to Ruth, and then When Life and Beliefs Collide. All of those are great books that I think a lot of guys wouldn't read because it's a female writer who's writing from a female perspective, but she has great insight. This is the first one I've read cover to cover by her because it talks about masculinity. So admittedly, I've skimmed some of her other works, but this one was really, really helpful.
Do similar works exist for pastors? I'm going to stay away from men writing on this subject. There's beaucoup men who've written on this subject. Are there other female writers that have written on this topic that you might recommend or think of?
There are other female authors who write about Christianity, following God, and who predominantly focus more on the feminine side of things. I haven't read a work that is a female perspective on masculinity, or just her bigger thing is it's not about masculinity or femininity, it's about pursuing God together. So I couldn't cite anything off the top of my head. This book, I think, provides a good corrective to the theological debates about complementarianism versus egalitarianism. There was one good book I picked up on that had several different authors. I think it was a Zondervan book. I don't know the title off the top of my head, but it had at least 10 different authors who wrote and provided different perspectives on a variety of topics. So that's the closest one, but unfortunately I can't give you a title, so this is worthless right now.
Okay. Well, Tim, thank you so much for the insight concerning this book, Malestrom, and thank you for tuning in. And I trust that you might pick this up. And Tim's correct. It is helpful to be reading from on issues like this from a female point of view. And we listen to our wives, but sometimes we need to listen to others that aren't our wives, and perhaps gain an insight into how another person might look at this issue. In the meantime, I trust that you'll have a great day, and that you will be a good image bearer of our God and our Savior. Thank you.